The object designated 3 I/Atlas entered human awareness not as a faint point of light on a telescope sensor, but as a figure already heavy with mystery. Unlike the first known interstellar visitor, 9 Oumuamua, and the second 2I/Borisov, this body arrived with behavior that refused to settle neatly into the known categories of comet or asteroid. Its trajectory was clear, an unmistakable hyperbolic path cutting across the solar system at a velocity no gravitational tether of the sun could restrain. But its passage was not silent. As it drew nearer and instruments focused their attention, it began to emit structured bursts of radiation, flashes and sequences that bore no resemblance to natural astrophysical processes. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The pattern was erratic at first, irregular pulses echoing from the object's surface. Astronomers debated whether these were artifacts of outgassing, perhaps ionized particles interacting with solar wind. Yet, as days stretched into weeks, the emissions sharpened. Repetition emerged, a rhythm too deliberate to dismiss. The signals encoded structure, and within that structure lay unmistakable order. The designation 3 I/Atlas, once the sterile label of a survey telescope, soon carried a weight that pressed on every observatory, laboratory, and command center on Earth. Humanity was witnessing an interstellar object that not only crossed through the solar system but chose to speak. The transmissions grew longer. They were not continuous streams, as though 3 I/Atlas were cautious about expending energy, but bursts that demanded attention, as if pausing to let the world absorb each sequence before offering the next. Engineers constructed vast arrays of radio receivers to catch every fragment. The patterns were translated into visual forms, reassembled into symbols that repeated across the bursts. At first, they resembled geometries: spirals, lattice frameworks, grids of intersecting lines. Then came cascades of numbers, prime sequences, ratios tied to fundamental constants, as if the object sought to establish common ground, a shared vocabulary written in the mathematics of the universe. The final transmission unfolded like no other. Where earlier bursts had been compact, this one stretched, unfurling over hours into a sustained and intricate display. It began with the familiar, a reintroduction of the constants, the framework of mathematics. Then the structure widened, layers of symbols stacked upon one another, resolving into diagrams that mirrored not the random geometry of earlier bursts, but precise forms. Circles nested within circles, arcs aligning into orbital paths, markers denoting spheres of influence. To the eyes of those who pored over it, this was a map, not a vague scattering of stars, but a rendering of nearby systems, each marked relative to a point that corresponded unmistakably with the sun. Yet it was not the map alone that carried the weight of a warning. Alongside it pulsed sequences of rising intensity, oscillations framed in brackets of silence, as though to emphasize urgency. Within the map, certain stars glowed brighter in the transmission's encoded spectrum. 3 were circled repeatedly, and the pulses coinciding with those markers built into a crescendo of repetition. Analysts found patterns that suggested time intervals, countdowns measured against pulsar frequencies. The message seemed to point towards specific directions and specific epochs, as if indicating when and where phenomena would occur. The world debated furiously what the transmission meant. Was it a cartographic gift? A gesture of interstellar communication intended to guide humanity toward destinations of significance? Or was it a warning etched into the only medium that could cross light years? An alert that dangers lurked along those paths, threats bound to unfold in time. The crescendos of intensity were interpreted by some as alarms, markers of peril. Others insisted they were invitations, signposts toward civilizations or resources beyond Earth's grasp. What unified the debate was not certainty, but the undeniable realization that the message carried intent. The atmosphere surrounding the event was unlike anything humanity had faced. Leaders convened in closed chambers, scientists worked without pause, and populations across the globe stared skyward with a mix of dread and wonder. The implications of the final transmission were not confined to academia. They reached into every household, every gathering place, every corner of culture. Stories of ancient warnings, of myths that spoke of messengers from the stars, were drawn into the moment. Humanity confronted, perhaps for the first time, not the abstract possibility of life beyond Earth, but the direct address of something or someone that had taken the time to shape a message, deliver it, and leave it behind like a beacon fading into the void. The implications stretched across disciplines. In physics, The precision of the constants reaffirmed universal truths, but also hinted at knowledge beyond current human grasp. In astronomy, the highlighted stars forced a reevaluation of priorities in observation, demanding that telescopes reorient toward systems that might harbor significance. In geopolitics, the transmission became a matter of urgency, with nations weighing whether the content should be treated as a common heritage of humankind or as strategic information to be guarded. The very fabric of human cooperation was tested against the gravity of an external signal that no boundary or border could contain. The psychological weight was immense. The knowledge that a silent object had crossed interstellar space and paused long enough to project a message unsettled the core assumptions of human existence. If 3I/Atlas carried within it the capacity to communicate across such distances, then the notion of isolation was shattered. Humanity could no longer claim to be alone, and that realization forced both exhilaration and terror. The warning, if warning it was, loomed as both a burden and a call to vigilance. The final moments of the transmission were stark in their simplicity. After hours of structured emission, the object fell silent. Observatories strained, waiting for another burst, another hint of continuation, but none came. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a malfunction, but the stillness of finality, as though the message had been delivered in its entirety, and nothing more would be offered. The world was left with fragments of patterns, maps etched in light, crescendos of urgency, and the lingering question of intent. What stood out most was not just the content, but the timing. 3I/Atlas transmitted only as it neared its closest approach to the sun, as though harnessing the energy for its final effort. Then, as it receded, its emissions faded completely. No trace of residual signal remained. This suggested deliberation, a controlled effort to maximize visibility. It was not chance, not accident, but choice. The entity or mechanism that controlled 3I/Atlas had calculated precisely when to deliver its message, ensuring it would be seen and studied before drifting back into interstellar darkness. The implications were staggering. If the transmission was a warning, then humanity stood at the threshold of knowledge of dangers not yet apparent. Perhaps cosmic phenomena, gamma-ray bursts, wandering stellar remnants, rogue objects, lay along the paths indicated in the map. If it was a summons, then perhaps civilizations awaited, beckoning Earth toward communion. Either interpretation demanded a transformation of perspective. No longer could human destiny be charted solely by internal ambition. It was now tethered to an awareness of the wider galaxy, a web of connections that extended beyond the solar system. For many, the emotional impact was overwhelming. Religions reeled, adapting doctrines to accommodate the undeniable reality that intelligence beyond Earth had left its mark. Philosophies of isolationism or human centrality faltered. The arts surged with depictions of the event, from canvases portraying the glowing object in the night sky to symphonies attempting to capture the cadence of its signals. A shared cultural lexicon emerged, binding disparate communities with the recognition that they all had heard the same voice from the stars. Scientists, meanwhile, wrestled with the responsibility of interpretation. Every line of the transmission was dissected, every ratio measured. The highlighted stars became the focus of missions still in planning, with debates raging over how quickly humanity should redirect resources toward exploration of those regions. The transmission acted as a catalyst, accelerating projects that might otherwise have lingered in the realm of long-term speculation. Space agencies felt the weight of urgency, compelled not by competition alone, but by the pressing sense that time itself might be limited. In classrooms, children learned not only of continents and oceans, but of the interstellar messenger that crossed the sky and spoke to Earth. Their imaginations were stirred by the possibility of connection, but also tempered by the awareness of warning. For the young, the final transmission of 3I/Atlas became less a scientific curiosity than a defining cultural story, a moment that would shape the framework of their futures as the object faded from detection, disappearing into the depths from which it had come. The transmission lingered as a permanent record. Humanity had been addressed directly, and the imprint of that communication could never be erased. The absence of aftermath did not soften the event, for its essence lay not in what followed but in the moment itself. The deliberate choice of a wandering body to leave behind a message that carried across the gulf of space. The silence that followed the passing of 3I/Atlas did not erase the resonance of its final act. Instead, the absence of further signals magnified the gravity of what had been given. The transmissions, finite and deliberate, had been entrusted to a species that now found itself the custodian of meaning that reached beyond Earth. Each nation, each institution, each person who glimpsed the decoded fragments of its message carried away a piece of that responsibility. Yet even with the collective memory secured, the urgency did not diminish. The world had not been left with closure, but with a riddle that seemed too vast to solve in a single lifetime. The scientific community experienced a seismic shift in focus. Before 3I/Atlas, astronomy had been largely a discipline of observation and hypothesis, extrapolating natural laws from distant phenomena. Now it became a field of translation. The object's final transmission demanded a new lexicon, one that blended astrophysics with semiotics, signal processing with anthropology. Laboratories across continents recalibrated their missions. Teams that had once competed for grants and telescope time found themselves aligned under a shared imperative. Radio observatories reconfigured their arrays to detect similar bursts from deep space, while mathematicians worked tirelessly to confirm whether the highlighted star systems carried patterns of resonance with the encoded signals. This transformation spilled into engineering. The challenge of building instruments capable of perceiving finer signals became paramount. Innovations were accelerated, funding surged, and what might have taken decades to achieve was now compressed into months. The pursuit of clarity drove advancements in receiver sensitivity, data compression, and signal isolation. The final transmission acted as both muse and taskmaster, pressing humanity to stretch its technological reach toward the scale demanded by the cosmos. Cultural reverberations grew as quickly as the scientific. In cities and towns across the globe, the event was not treated as abstract but as intimate, something that could not be confined to academic circles. Artists sought to capture the essence of the moment, rendering the encoded maps as luminous murals on walls, sculpting three-dimensional interpretations of the nested circles, weaving the cadence of pulses into music. The language of the transmission seeped into literature, fashion, and film. Fictional works drew upon the mystery, but what made them compelling was that they did not feel entirely fictional. They were tethered to a real event, a cosmic communique that had been witnessed collectively. Religions across the spectrum encountered a crucible moment. Some interpreted the transmission as affirmation of long-held beliefs, that the universe was alive with intelligence, and that humanity was part of a grander design. Others struggled, their doctrines shaken by the undeniable evidence of minds beyond Earth. Pilgrimages were launched to observatories as though the telescopes themselves had become holy sites. In sermons and teachings, leaders urged calm, reflection, and humility before the possibility that humanity had been addressed by an intelligence immeasurably older and wiser. This did not fracture faith so much as it reshaped it, adding new dimensions of wonder and fear. Among the general population, curiosity became inseparable from anxiety. Ordinary people debated the implications late into the night, whether at kitchen tables, in digital forums, or in hushed conversations under star-filled skies. What did it mean if the transmission was indeed a warning? What forces or events could be so catastrophic that another intelligence would dedicate resources to ensuring their message reached an unfamiliar world? Was it benevolence? Or was it a gesture of self-preservation? An attempt to steer others away from hazards already known? These questions did not fade with time. They were not the kind that could be answered quickly or neatly. Governments were compelled to treat the final transmission as both opportunity and threat. Intelligence agencies scrutinized the data, wary that interpretation errors could mask dangers or invite vulnerabilities. Defense ministries debated what preparations, if any, could be made against scenarios no human had yet imagined. Diplomatic channels carried the burden of deciding how open the information should be. Some leaders leaned toward transparency, insisting that the message belonged to all of humanity. Others pushed for caution, guarding details under the belief that misinterpretation could spark chaos. The tension between openness and secrecy intensified, reflecting the wider tension between unity and division that defined humanity's response. Despite these divisions, one truth became inescapable. The final transmission had redefined humanity's place in the cosmos. No longer could humanity consider itself as isolated wanderers in a silent universe. The encounter with 3I/Atlas had shattered that illusion, replacing it with the reality of participation in a larger story. For the first time, human civilization had evidence that the universe contained not only phenomena, but intention. The academic world grappled with the philosophical consequences. Scholars of ethics argued over the obligations of a species newly addressed by another intelligence. Should humanity prepare to respond? Could silence be seen as ingratitude or defiance? Or was the wiser path to remain listeners, absorbing what was given without attempting to speak back prematurely? These debates grew alongside discussions of ontology. If intelligence elsewhere had chosen to reveal itself, what did that say about the conditions of consciousness in the universe? Were civilizations bound by a duty to warn one another? To mark the paths of danger and opportunity across interstellar distances? The implications spiraled into profound reflections on the nature of existence itself. In the absence of additional signals, the final transmission became an enduring touchstone. Every new telescope image, every particle experiment, every cosmic survey was filtered through the lens of what had been received. Was this star system one of those circled in the map? Could this pulsar correspond to the rhythmic pulses embedded in the sequence? The legacy of 3I/Atlas's message wove itself into the fabric of every new discovery, like a watermark that could not be erased. The implications extended even further into the domain of identity. For centuries, human culture had been fragmented by national borders, languages, and traditions. The transmission did not erase those divisions, but it overshadowed them with a reminder of shared fate. Earth itself had been addressed as a single entity. The transmission had not distinguished between continents or creeds. It had looked upon the planet as one. This perspective, imposed from without, seeped slowly into the consciousness of billions. For the first time, many began to perceive themselves less as members of competing tribes and more as participants in a planetary whole. This shift in identity carried with it new anxieties. If humanity was no longer alone, then humanity was no longer shielded by obscurity. The stars were no longer a backdrop, but a network of possible connections, some benign, others perhaps hostile. The awareness of being visible, of being vulnerable, weighed heavily. Questions of survival became paramount. Could humanity endure in a cosmos where unknown intelligences might hold technology millennia ahead of its own? Would the act of having been addressed invite further contact? And if so, would humanity be prepared for what came next? The debate over preparation intensified. Some argued that the wisest course was to strengthen defenses, to prepare Earth against possibilities of intrusion. Others countered that hostility would be self-defeating, that survival lay in understanding and cooperation. Still, others insisted that humanity must accelerate its own expansion, leaving Earth behind to establish footholds across the solar system before it was too late. In this way, the transmission did not merely stir thought, it catalyzed action. Plans for lunar bases, Martian colonies, and asteroid outposts were revisited with renewed urgency, framed not only as dreams of exploration, but as necessities of resilience. The intellectual challenge of the transmission remained as daunting as the cultural and political ones. Deciphering symbols that had no precedent demanded leaps of imagination. Teams composed not only of scientists, but of linguists, anthropologists, and even historians of ancient languages were assembled to interpret patterns. Every shape and ratio was scrutinized, every silence considered as deliberate as the bursts of sound. The process resembled the decoding of a cosmic Rosetta Stone, though one without the benefit of translation into familiar tongue. Progress was incremental, and each insight was hard-won. The enduring mystery lay in intent. The symbols could be mapped, the pulses measured, the diagrams reconstructed, but intent refused to yield. What compelled 3I/Atlas, or whatever intelligence guided it, to issue its final transmission? Was it an act of altruism, or of self-preservation, or something so far beyond human categories that no label could suffice? The lack of an answer pressed upon every interpreter, leaving them suspended between hope and dread. Over time, the final transmission became less a single event than a prism through which humanity viewed itself. It forced recognition of fragility, the recognition that even on the scale of stars and galaxies, Earth was but a fragile sphere, vulnerable to forces barely understood. Yet it also ignited recognition of potential, the potential to listen, to learn, and perhaps one day, to reply. The event drew out both fear and courage, demanding that both coexist in the human heart. The echoes of the transmission persisted in unexpected places. Children played games based on the coded maps, tracing imaginary voyages to circled stars. Musicians incorporated the rhythm of pulses into their compositions, letting audiences feel the beat of cosmic communication. Even in commerce, the motifs of 3i/Atlas appeared. Logos bearing its nested circles, fashion embroidered with its lattices, products branded with the notion of being interstellar. In this way, the transmission ceased to belong solely to scholars and leaders. It became part of daily life, woven into the ordinary fabric of existence. Yet, amid this absorption into culture, the profound seriousness of the transmission remained intact. Its mystery could not be diluted by adaptation. Behind every playful imitation lay the awareness of an unresolved warning or invitation. This duality of integration into the everyday alongside reverence for the extraordinary ensured that the final transmission remained both familiar and sacred. The true weight of the event lay in its permanence. 3i/Atlas had departed, fading beyond the reach of instruments, yet its message endured. It could not be recalled or rescinded. Humanity carried it now, not as a choice, but as inheritance. In laboratories, in classrooms, in gatherings of leaders and citizens, the question lingered, persistent as the stars themselves. What had the transmission meant, and how should humanity respond? In the silence that followed, the world was compelled not only to search the sky, but to search itself. The final transmission of 3i/Atlas had offered no aftermath, no conclusion, only the certainty that humanity had been addressed. That certainty, unyielding and profound, marked the threshold of a new era in which the universe itself had spoken and Earth had listened. The weight of the final transmission lingered most profoundly in the unbroken fact that it had been finite. A single act, complete in itself, not subject to amendment or continuation, had left humanity facing an unalterable archive. That permanence gave rise to a unique kind of intellectual hunger. Scholars, poets, engineers, and mystics alike found themselves returning to the same symbols and sequences, not because new information appeared, but because the material already delivered seemed inexhaustible in its possibilities. The transmission's finitude transformed it into something akin to scripture, a text endlessly reinterpreted, always hinting at greater depths than had yet been uncovered. The stars identified in the transmission quickly became sites of obsession. Observatories dedicated unprecedented time to the three circled systems. Each of them was scrutinized across the electromagnetic spectrum. Spectroscopy searched for chemical markers in exoplanet atmospheres. Radio dishes strained for faint anomalies, and infrared telescopes scanned for waste heat that might indicate technological activity. The heightened scrutiny reoriented the very priorities of astronomy, compressing centuries of curiosity into an urgent hunt. For the first time in human history, specific stars were not just objects of distant wonder, but touchstones of potential communication. This redirection reshaped global collaboration. Traditionally, observatories had competed for access, each vying to publish first and achieve prestige. After the transmission, competition was tempered by the recognition that no single institution could interpret the message alone. Data was pooled into shared repositories, and teams were assembled that crossed not only national borders but disciplinary boundaries. Mathematicians worked alongside linguists, computer scientists alongside archaeologists, particle physicists alongside philosophers. The transmission compelled the world to function as a collective intelligence, mirroring perhaps the very process that had produced the message in the first place. The sciences adjacent to astronomy experienced their own transformation. Biology, long focused on the intricacies of Earth's life, began to recalibrate its definitions. If intelligence elsewhere had chosen to communicate, then life was not confined to Earth's fragile biosphere. The field of astrobiology was thrust from speculative margins into central relevance. Universities expanded programs that once struggled for recognition, and suddenly the study of extremophiles, the biochemistry of alien atmospheres, and the models of non-terrestrial ecologies became not peripheral curiosities, but urgent lines of inquiry. The question shifted from whether life existed elsewhere to what forms it might take, and how such forms could give rise to the capacity for communication across interstellar gulfs. Even fields seemingly distant from the cosmos found themselves drawn into the gravity of 3i/Atlas's legacy. Political science explored the consequences of a planetary identity imposed by external address. Sociology mapped the cultural responses that spread like waves across diverse communities. Psychology probed the dual response of awe and dread, the way individuals balance the exhilaration of confirmation with the terror of implication. Each discipline was compelled to interpret, to find relevance in the face of something that resisted confinement to any one domain. The transmission also forced humanity to reconsider time itself. Embedded within the signals were ratios that appeared to indicate intervals, references to pulsar periods that suggested countdowns or epochs of significance. This raised questions not only about when events might occur, but about how civilizations communicate across spans that dwarf human history. The prospect that the transmission spoke of times thousands or even millions of years ahead challenged the human concept of urgency. It forced a reckoning with patience, with preparation across generations rather than within political or economic cycles. For the first time, civilizations accustomed to thinking in decades were compelled to imagine stewardship over epochs. This reorientation toward deep time found expression in architecture and design. Projects emerged that aimed to preserve the transmission in materials resistant to erosion, engraved into stone or encoded within crystals designed to last longer than nations, longer even than continents. These monuments were not intended as memorials but as safeguards, ensuring that even if civilizations rose and fell, the message would remain decipherable to their descendants. Humanity began to act not only as a present listener, but as a custodian for future interpreters. The aesthetic of the transmission itself shaped new artistic movements. Painters reimagined the nested circles and arcs as cosmic mandalas, symbols of both order and mystery. Musicians experimented with the rhythm of the pulses, creating compositions that blurred the line between music and mathematics. Writers used the map as the backdrop for narratives, setting their stories in imagined worlds orbiting the stars that had been circled. These artistic responses did not claim to interpret the transmission definitively, but to live alongside it, to let its mystery infuse human creativity. Meanwhile, the philosophy of communication underwent a radical expansion. For millennia, communication had been studied in terms of human-to-human interaction. Now, scholars found themselves asking what it meant to speak to the unknown, to reach across gulfs where no shared language, culture, or biology existed. Theories of semiotics were stretched to their limits, redefined to include not just the symbolic frameworks of Earth, but the possibility of universal structures embedded in mathematics and physics. Entire schools of thought arose around the idea that mathematics might serve as the lingua franca of the cosmos, a medium through which minds separated by light years could find commonality. Ethical debates grew as fierce as technical ones. Was it responsible to attempt a reply? Some argued that silence was safer, that announcing humanity's presence further might expose Earth to dangers beyond comprehension. Others insisted that the very act of having been addressed imposed a duty to respond, to acknowledge receipt of the message. Still others cautioned that any attempt at reply might distort or misrepresent humanity, projecting fragments of identity that could not encompass the whole. The debates reflected a deeper struggle, the balance between fear of vulnerability and desire for connection. The possibility of intention behind the transmission also invited speculation about motive. If it was a warning, then what hazards could justify such an effort? Some scientists argued it might be stellar phenomena, supernovae, rogue planets, or regions of intense radiation. Others wondered if it pointed to civilizational hazards, lessons passed down by beings who had endured catastrophes and wished to shield others from repeating their mistakes. The notion that advanced civilizations might carry not only technology but responsibility added a moral dimension to the cosmos, suggesting that intelligence and ethics might evolve together. The ordinary lives of people were not untouched. The event seeped into language itself. Everyday metaphors began to draw upon it. To be circled like a star meant to be singled out. To speak in pulses meant to communicate with brevity and intensity. These phrases reflected the way the transmission had embedded itself into collective consciousness. Even those who did not follow the technical details felt its presence in the idioms they used, the symbols they saw, the stories they told their children. Education became a central arena of transformation. Schools incorporated the transmission into curricula, not only in science but in literature, art, and history. Children grew up tracing the encoded diagrams, reciting the prime numbers that had been pulsed, imagining themselves as future interpreters. The next generation did not inherit the mystery as something foreign, but as a foundational fact of their world. For them, the universe was not an empty expanse, but a place where messages could appear, where the unknown could speak. Perhaps the most profound consequence lay in the way the transmission redefined silence. Before 3I/Atlas, the silence of the universe was interpreted as emptiness, the absence of voices. Afterwards, silence carried new meaning. It became the pause after communication, the stillness that follows a statement awaiting reply. The stars themselves seemed less indifferent, their quiet imbued with the possibility of intention withheld. Every moment of listening became charged, not with despair at the void, but with anticipation of further resonance. This anticipation carried with it a paradoxical sense of intimacy. To be addressed by something so distant, something that would never return, was to feel both profoundly small and profoundly connected. The intimacy lay not in familiarity, but in acknowledgement. Humanity had been seen, and in that recognition lay a transformation of self-perception. Even without knowing the identity or motives of the sender, the simple fact of acknowledgement conferred significance. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on 3I/Atlas's final warning? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.